So kind of the underrepresented populations that I'm primarily going to be focusing on in my larger class, where I'm going to get into much more detail about this, is about first talking about women or people who are assigned female at birth or female socialized individuals. Is that, this is an underrepresented population for a multitude of reasons. We're going to put aside the fact that the United States didn't require people to do medical research on women until the 90s. We're going to put that part aside. Um, and really, one of the biggest things around why this is an underrepresented population is because the initial research was primarily done on little white boys. That's where they looked at a lot. Um, and because of how we teach behavior, right? Behavior is taught through a like gendered lens, and as I get into our next category, we'll talk more about it. How it's also done through a racial lens. So ADHD, like or just behavior teaching in general, when we parent, we teach it through a gendered lens of girls are supposed to do this, males are supposed to do that. Males can do whatever they want and externalize all of their feelings, whereas we expect women or girls to keep it together. Shrink it. Don't be so dramatic. You've got too many big feelings. You better mask it. Like essentially promoting masking, which is one of the reasons we're seeing a lot more women being diagnosed later in life right now, right? Women tend to internalize symptoms more, which is why they tend to also be underdiagnosed, is that you're not going to see them be the ones that are, for the most part, running around the office who can't sit still. You're going to see them be the people who have overly racing thoughts. So remember when I said function of the behavior? When I have somebody who's AFAB talking about racing thoughts, like I'll ask, well, what does that mean? Or like they can't stop thinking about things. What does that mean for you? What does that look like in practice for you? Because instead of being able to like be impulsive as much with their language, they're internalizing it because that's how they've been taught to behave, right? Then people of the global majority. So this is a term that has been working its way to replace BIPOC or POC, for like Black and Indigenous people of color or just people of color. And this is like referencing to the fact that the global majority of people, are Black, Asian, Brown, of dual heritage, or Indigenous to different aspects of global and have been, racialized as ethnic minorities, but they actually represent 80% of the world's population. So I've actually really liked this using this term more in the last couple of years, even though people are not as familiar with it. And it was developed by an anti-racist advocate or activist of Black, African, and Caribbean heritage, Rosemary Campbell Stevens. Um, so I've found the verbiage to be helpful for people, right? And again, behavior is taught through a racial lens. Young white boys are allowed to act out. Young Black boys are often more diagnosed with a disruptive behavior diagnosis in the process of being evaluated for ADHD if they get evaluated. Keywords. We see this with people of different ethnic backgrounds being less likely for a multitude of reasons. Either access to appropriate providers, different cultural perceptions of both the medical system, mental health, and linguistic barriers. Like just because we use the term ADHD in the West doesn't mean that's how Asia describes this or how India describes, ADHD. That's not the verbiage that they use. And so it can sometimes make it hard to access these things if we don't have a more cultural awareness of what this looks like. And especially after they've controlled in different studies for poverty status, highest education and household attained, child's sex, and child's age, they found that compared to white youth, who are the most likely to receive an ADHD diagnosis, Black youth are 22% less likely, Latina or Latinx youth are 32% less likely, and Asian youth are 73% less likely to receive an ADHD diagnosis and be evaluated. Just like that's a huge difference. right? And like how different cultures view these behaviors and like the roles that people have served in their different communities with this, right? Also impacts how we do it. And like while there's been a big push for the DSM to account for different cultural expressions of symptoms, it's not how we're taught to look at it. And that's the big piece about I keep coming back to how we're taught and that we need to be taught to think more culturally aware. And then finally, individuals with a higher education attained, right? While, like I said earlier, statistics indicate that people with ADHD are less likely to attain any education outside after high school, that doesn't mean it's impossible. I've worked with people who have their masters, their bachelors, JDs that are in levels or positions of power at different in different areas and different structures, who are MDs, PhDs, the whole shebang. It is harder, and oftentimes this is where clinician bias of who can have ADHD really comes into play. I read a neuropsych eval for a patient where they commented on her master's degrees or master's degree. And I was like, So even though she did all these things, we're still going to go no? Okay, okay, right? Research has validated multiple times how people who are intelligent can still have ADHD. ADHD is not a lack of intelligence. It's kind of like the ability to focus your intelligence, right? It's the inability to regulate the things that you're interested in, inability to regulate where your focus goes, right? Um, there's a study that I have from the UK where they looked at different providers that have high prevalence of ADHD, and they found that in the UK, 12.5% of lawyers have it. 14% of pharmacists, um, you know, physicians assistants are like about 9%. And of the doctors that they screened, like medical doctors, over a third screened positive on the ASRS, which is the adult screening self-report scale that people typically use for ADHD, right? And believe it or not, this is an area that there needs to be a lot more research in, I will admit. Addressing ADHD in higher education individuals is not well researched. The majority of the research I found to see like what has been done is actually doctoral theses that people have done around the country on this and talking about the barriers that occur. Like I really like this one from somebody from Dr. Deval from the University of Tennessee that she completed her degree, or they completed their degree in 2022. It said that this is an important finding in that graduate students with ADHD may, on the surface, appear to be successful, but they are still struggling with being misunderstood by their professors compared to their peers that don't have the same level of difficulty that they have, right? Right. We didn't totally get into like the ways in which ADHD impacts how we communicate with others, right? How we understand communication. Those are other areas of executive functioning is auditory processing. What I like to call the buffer for people who, grew up with Windows 95. You remember the 5 minutes to load a web page? Sometimes that's what auditory processing feels like. It's I'm operating on a an updated computer, but with Windows 95 software, right? And so we definitely need more research around this area of individuals. So like across the lifespan. So like when we talk about the financial impacts, in general, people with ADHD tend to have more financial issues throughout their lifespan because of that ADHD tax I mentioned, and because, and it's going to tie into employment, because people tend to have poorer performance with ADHD. We tend to make less overall in our lifespan and tend to have more occupational difficulties in different positions, right? Like I've highlighted the education piece, that it's harder to attain a higher education level. In fact, I think it was less than, what was it, 0.03% of individuals that had been researched in one study they had found having a degree other than a bachelor's or higher than a bachelor's, right? It impacts relationships, being able to connect with another person. A lot of people with ADHD, struggling with their emotional regulation and how that shows up in a relationship with all, typically all this ghosting behavior that we have now in the current dating cycle, and a lot of anxious attachment as a result. I think the biggest piece here is health, is that we are seeing more and more um, that there are, and that's actually what I highlighted in a comment that I had made on that person's post about the article, or their post about the testing that's coming up for trying to identify ADHD in a more like streamlined way. I said we are seeing so many medical issues that are comorbid with ADHD now, um, related to different gene theories and things as we learn more about it, that it's going to be really hard to differentiate between them, because not everybody who has ADHD will end up with these medical comorbidities, but many do. And several studies have looked at the economic burden of healthcare costs regarding it. And they said that, what was this? What year was this? This article by Cortez et al. From 2025 that I found that in the US, in relation to healthcare costs, productivity, income loss, education, and judicial system involvement related to ADHD was anywhere between $1,100 and $4,100 per adult per year, which is on par with that of similar complex chronic somatic conditions. Right? And in Sweden, they found that adults who were 30 to 45 who were newly diagnosed with ADHD had significantly higher healthcare costs and utilization compared to those without ADHD. Right? Another practical example, like outside of just having possibly other chronic conditions, people forget appointments. Like that's missed appointment fees, longer wait times to get care for certain things, which makes things harder to diagnose.